Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins proudly presents the Origin Science Scholars Program. The Institute advances the scientific understanding and application of origins and evolution of human and natural systems. The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented with the assistance of Case Western Reserve University's Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision.
Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patricia Princehouse. Dr. Princehouse is the Director of Undergraduate Majors in Origins and in Evolutionary Biology at Case Western Reserve University, and she is Outreach Director of the Institute for the Science of Origins. She's an evolutionary biologist and historian of science by training. And Dr. Princehouse applies her knowledge of genetics and evolution to the scientific breeding of champion Pyrenean shepherds. Dr. Princehouse.
Thank you. Extreme evolution, what do you mean by that? What are you going to talk about? And it's true, there are so many things we could talk about. I'm going to start with something that's perhaps not extreme, but it's unusual. This is a site in Africa, a fossil site where I've worked, called Songor in the Lake Victoria region of Kenya. And this contains sediments from about 19 million years ago, and it was a forest environment at the time. The site is not a forest environment today, as you can see. It was first worked on by Louis Leakey in the 30s. And then more recently, my colleague Isaiah Nengo and I have worked on it. Here's what it looks like today. And when you remove the foliage of the site, here's where you can actually see the fossils. The site is notable in many ways, but particularly for, at least of particular interest to myself and to Isaiah, is that there are a lot of primates there, and particularly a lot of apes. There are, in fact, 6 different species of apes living in the same place at the same time. And that's really unusual. And it's not just that they are close relatives living there together. These are individual apes that have come from different places originally and ended up in the forests of Songor there. You don't need to know the particular phylogeny here. It's exactly how they're related is a matter of discussion, but everyone agrees that they're not each other's closest relatives. Right? And so what's different about that is that apes don't live together today. There's nowhere in the world that you can look and find a bunch of apes living together of different species, a bunch of different species of apes. And partly, people come up with reasons for this. Well, they're too big. There's not enough resources. All kinds of things that people say, and you can think about that as far as the gorilla. But if we're going to use modern ecosystems and species to think about the species of the past, then you could think about, what primates are there where you get a certain number of them living together. And you do get lemurs on Madagascar living together in similar spaces. And you get some monkeys living together in the same place, such as these Guenon monkeys. And it's interesting because these guys live in the same forests. I mean, not every single one of these lives in exactly every patch of forest, right? But they overlap enormously, and you'll have sometimes 6 species living in the same area at the same time. And as a result, you get these elaborate patterns. And this enables the monkeys to recognize members of their own species, right? Because it's dark in the trees, sort of thing. So these flashes of white in these particular ways. Monkeys whose genetic constitutions allow them to instantly recognize that as a member of their species are ones that leave fertile offspring. If they cross with another species, they're not going to leave fertile offspring, and so those genes will be weeded out of the population. So natural selection is fine-tuning this in that circumstance. And so one of the questions that I'm thinking about as far as our 6 species of apes living in 19 million years ago in the same place, maybe they had elaborate color patterns like this. Usually when you look in the fossil, at the reconstructions of the fossil apes, they look like chimpanzees. They're sort of brown or this sort of thing. What if it's more like the colors we've been seeing in the dinosaurs lately? We should perhaps be representing our apes like this. which would make them a little more extreme in addition to being unusual. So if that's not extreme enough for you, this is an ice fish, which some of you I think are familiar with, but others it may be the first time seeing them. They live in the waters of Antarctica. Some of them, like this one, are transparent. They're transparent because they have no red blood cells. So how does this animal bring oxygen to its tissues if it has no red blood cells, right? And the answer is that it uses myoglobin instead of hemoglobin to do that. And what it's developed is this glycoprotein antifreeze. And so these fish are able to live in regions where the water is super cold but still liquid because of the salt content. So it is below freezing, although it's still able to swim through it, right? But ice crystals will form in its blood, right? And so these glycoproteins, this antifreeze goes and attaches to the ice crystals, sequesters them, melts them down, and the fish swims on. And this is a group that has become quite successful in these areas. The sorts of niches that are filled around the world by other kinds of fish are filled solely by different kinds of ice fish in these environments because they're the only ones that have this kind of breakthrough adaptation that's allowed this kind of radiation, right? So that's kind of extreme, not just in characteristics, but in its effect on the ecosystem. Here's another rather extreme organism. Can you hear me? Did it cut out? There we go. The other extreme organism, this is called the Yeti crab. This is my current favorite group of organisms. They are found in the hydrothermal vents in the deep ocean, right? And they're big. They're like this big. They're not little tiny things. Most of the vent fauna you think of as pretty small. These are pretty prominent. The first one of these was discovered in 2005. So for 30 years we've been looking at hydrothermal vents and not seen these. Now there are 3 species that are known. Probably there will be others. They have no eyes, right? There's no light down there, and so like a lot of cave organisms, it's not a cave, but it's low light, they have no eyes, and they have no color. What they do have are these amazing hairy legs, or setae rather than hair. And the elongation of the forelimb and the long hairs, the long setae on them, provide a breeding ground for chemosynthetic bacteria. And these are bacteria that have started to use carbon, for the most part, carbon dioxide, to get their energy. So they'll break down molecules instead of using chlorophyll or this sort of thing, right, or mitochondria. So we have these chemosynthetic bacteria. And interestingly enough, these are all also related, right? They are not the result of convergent evolution, but it is one group that emerged in the Cretaceous and then spread out, it looks like around the Oligocene, so around 40 million years ago. And so far they've been found in both the northern and southern Pacific. And I'll bet that we're going to find some more of them. They're somewhat related to lobsters and crabs and shrimp, but they are a group that split off before the modern radiation of our current lobsters and crabs and shrimp. And so it retains some of what are sometimes called primitive traits or basal characteristics, right? So it's very interesting looking at the family tree. It fills a niche there in the family tree as well that was sort of empty. Even though it has these extreme specializations, some others of its characteristics are useful for reconstructing evolutionary history. As I mentioned, of course, these are not the only blind animals. We have famously blind cave fish, and these are blind cave fish, Mexican blind cave fish, the ones that live in light and the relatives that live in the caves. These can actually still interbreed. And one question that Darwin had when he first saw these blind fish, are these related to each other the way that the Yeti crabs are radiation of the same original stock, or has this happened in parallel, so that you'll have fish that are related to the cave fish, in the lighted areas, right, on the ground surface, everywhere, and the cave ones are just, versions of those that have gone deep and stayed deep in the caves. And the answer is that you'll find both. You'll find some that are members of the same evolutionary group, probably originally in contiguous caves in some manner or transported in some way. And you'll also find this blind cave fish as convergent evolution in lots of different places. And it's not just in fish. This is a blind cricket, a cave cricket. It has no eyes. The legged one there, the white one. There's a blind crab there, and a blind salamander, a cave salamander. So it's the sort of thing that happens again and again and again, and something you can point to for natural selection, saying, well, here's natural selection that acts in a similar way under particular conditions, which kind of gives the lie to folks that claim natural selection is just random. Natural selection is the opposite of random, right? Given the same conditions and the same genetic variation, it tends to do the same thing in different settings. Right? The champion of natural selection, Darwin, right? He was very interested in crabs and in blind crabs, blind cave fish, things like that. And he noted even that in some of the crabs, the stalk for the eye remains, but the eye itself is gone. So you can see the tracks of history in this. So he says the stand for the telescope is there, that the telescope with its glasses have been lost. And he says, however, that natural selection did not cause the elimination of the eyes in the cave fish. He says, as it's difficult to imagine that eyes, although useless, could in any way be injurious to animals living in darkness, I attribute their loss solely to disuse and not to natural selection for any particular thing. In that context, talking about what we call today homologies, a term that was newly coined at the time by Richard Owen, he says, the framework of the bones being the same in the hand of a man, the wing of a bat, the fin of a porpoise, and the leg of a horse, the same number of vertebrae forming the neck of the giraffe and of the elephant, and innumerable other such facts at once explain themselves on the theory of descent with slow and slight successive modifications. And with that, we'll go to some questions.
The ice fish. Couple of quick questions there. Would the ice fish have radiated outward from a species that would be cousin to a species that would be a non-ice water type creature? Okay, and is it edible?
Depends on how hungry you are. It's what? It's mackerel. It's related to mackerel.
So it does have a living cousin per se. Oh, okay, cool.
You talked about the various kinds of apes that live together in groups without being, but they are infertile when they mate with other types of apes living within that same area. When you consider man and the Neanderthal, why are they still fertile with each other?
The answer is that nature does not always fit into our boxes that we provide for it, right? If you think of all of evolutionary history, you've got one species splits into multiple populations. Some of those populations go extinct. Others of those populations leave descendant populations. So by the time that you have a species formed that would not be able to reproduce with the parent population or with another one, it's often gone quite far down the line, right? And so if you happen to have descendants that are sort of going in different directions that end up meeting each other, and not as many chromosomal rearrangements have been made so that they're fully infertile, you can have a certain amount of interbreeding. And that's what happened in the case with Neanderthals. And it's not just us and Neanderthal, it happens very regularly because species are an illusion, right? At any point in time, you could try to decide how many species there are, but give it 10,000 years and there are going to be more or less. Unfortunately, now less. It tends to be the case. But in the case of some of these tree frogs, you'll have new species arising in just a few thousand years, right? But in the meantime, they would be able to breed with a parent or a cousin or other populations. And so it's this dynamic process. One of the things that surprised folks in the 1940s, such as Ernst Mayr, was that in trying to figure out how many species there are and what makes a species, they found that there are what they ended up calling ring species. So if you have herring gulls, for example, in England that can breed with the ones in Scandinavia and on around to the ones in Siberia and into Alaska, whatever, by the time you get to Canada, they can't breed with the ones in England, right? So enough changes have happened that they are at that point infertile with what is descended from the ancestral population just as much. But they can breed along the way. And this is how it is in time as well. You just take a ring species, but look at it over time, and at some point there'll be enough changes. Sometimes you'll get very discrete changes. There are instances of speciation within a very short period of time. But in other cases, you have this gradual differentiation, and I think that's what we're looking at with the Neanderthals. You'll also see it in modern-day wolves and dogs, right? Coyotes and wolves can interbreed. They just don't. They don't recognize each other as members of the same species, and so they don't breed. Wolves and dogs don't have that problem.
Thank you for joining us. You've been watching Dr. Patricia Princehouse discussing some examples of animals that have evolved features that are unusual in some way. For more information on the Origins Science Scholars Program, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu. In the next part of the talk, Dr. Princehouse will discuss different ideas on how extreme traits evolve. Now, back to the talk.
So I'd mentioned with the last slide that Darwin talked about homology, said these sorts of slow, slight, successive modifications result in things like wonderful adaptations and also in things like blind cavefish, right? And so Darwin, of course, we see, sort of historically triumphant. Darwin was right. He got all this stuff right. He is an amazing figure historically and an amazing man. It doesn't mean that everything ended with Darwin, right? Science has gone on. And Ernst Mayr, the fellow that I mentioned a minute ago, who was talking about ring species and wrote a book in 1942 called Systematics and the Origin of Species, has this to say about Darwin. Darwin was wrong in his discussions of inheritance and the origin of variation, confused about varieties and species, and unable to elucidate the problem of the multiplication of species. So Darwin's book was called The Origin of Species. Basically, what did he get right if he's wrong about all these things, right? And it's just a very interesting phenomenon. So if you ask Ernst Mayr, maybe Darwin was wrong. And that's where you have to take a closer look. And this is why there's ongoing study in evolutionary biology, and it's such an open field with a lot of breakthroughs going on and interesting stuff. Darwin had multiple mechanisms, and Ernst Mayr was trying to pin him down to just being about natural selection. Darwin, mentioning disuse of the eyes of the cave crab, right, wasn't talking about natural selection, causing that, or just random accumulation of mutations. He was talking about what we call a Lamarckian form of inheritance, right? That use and disuse of a part seemed to make it more important to the animal or less important to the animal. And that in some ways, just as Lamarck had talked about animals sort of having a vital force that would flow to, the famous example is the giraffe's neck, right? As the giraffe is reaching for the higher leaves, the body's fluids flow to that and elongate the neck, and that is then passed on to the offspring. Whereas not using the neck, not stretching it, not pulling vital force to those things would not result in a longer thing, might result in a shorter neck sort of thing. Darwin hated the idea of the special fluid, right? He wanted a completely material basis in the sort of modern chemistry, right? But it's all around you if you look. Things appear to work that way, right? It's very hard to distinguish the result of genetic selection on genetic characteristics, hard inheritance, and this so-called soft inheritance, unless you're really able to, as we are now, to look at the actual gene frequencies, right? So it's really hard to pin it down. And everybody at Darwin's time, it was just common knowledge that use and disuse would provoke, blacksmiths tended to have kids with larger arms. They tended to go into blacksmithing, right? Now, of course, we would say, well, the kids were, that's entirely physiological. They were helping their dad lift things, and they had bigger arms for that reason. But at the time, just as an example, there was a debate whether there was, you could get disuse of a part, making that, resulting in that part being smaller by it being mutilated in some manner. And even on that, Darwin said sometimes. Yeah. So anyway, so he had use and disuse. He had correlations of growth, which today we would call basically allometry, right? As one part gets longer, another part preferentially will get longer or shorter, right? There are sort of algorithms in the body as far as how things change in an evolutionary sense. Similarly, embryology. These together are the laws of growth, as Darwin called them, right? You can't just, decide, I want to take some dachshunds and I'm going to breed a Barney purple dinosaur. I'll just breed the purplest ones together and the ones that have the most dinosaur traits, right? You can't do that because of the way that the genome is structured and development is structured and things like that. There are constraints on it. And so natural selection is not infinitely plastic. It doesn't have infinite power. And Darwin recognized that. And he recognized that these correlations of growth were an important indication of that. And of course, natural selection. But he said about natural selection, because even in his day, people were trying to box him into, natural selection is everything. He says, great is the power of steady misrepresentation. So, yeah. And so, getting back to talk about the Lamarckian characteristics, what is up with giraffes? Speaking about extreme creatures, that's pretty extreme, This is a giraffe looking in the second-story window of a castle, right? It's really quite amazing. Here's an animal. We talk about allometry, right? The neck is long, the legs are long, the body kind of has stayed the same size, and you end up with situations like this, right? And yet, if you found this in the fossil record and you tried to tell your colleagues that something like this was going on and they were having to do this, they would be laughed out of the, of the meeting, right? And yet, we know it happens. So, and of course, there are special valves in the neck to allow it to do this. But anyway, it wasn't Darwin who had a problem with Lamarck as far as the giraffe's neck at the time. It was his co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, right? And Wallace said, the hypothesis of Lamarck that progressive changes in species have been produced by the attempts of animals to increase the development of their own organs and thus modify their structure and habits. Neither did the giraffe acquire its long neck by desiring to reach the foliage of the more lofty shrubs, right? So Wallace was the ultra-selectionist in the day, not Darwin, right? He's like, natural selection is the only process. It has to be that giraffes with longer necks bred together, and then that's the only way, which led to some interesting views that he had on human evolution, where he parted ways with Darwin. So neither did the giraffe acquire its long neck by desiring to reach the foliage of the more lofty shrubs and constantly stretching its neck for the purpose, but because any varieties which occurred among its antitypes with a longer neck than usual at once secured a fresh range of pasture over the same ground as their shorter-necked companions, and on the first scarcity of food were thereby enabled to outlive them. Right? Now that is what we think, basically, right, these days. We don't think that the giraffe gets special fluid rushing to it when it stretches its neck, right? So in this case, but this example has shown up in textbooks, especially in the 60s, where we started getting this this sort of scientific revolution's view of playing Darwin off against Lamarck, when in fact many of their views coincided much more closely, right? So anyway, what Darwin cared about in the giraffe, what he thought needed explanation, is this tail. This tail is 8 feet long. And it's got, the end of it looks nothing like the top. He says it looks like, the tail of the giraffe looks like an artificially constructed fly flapper. And it seems at first incredible that this could have been adapted for its present purpose by successive slight modifications, each better and better, for so trifling an object as driving away flies, right? And so he's looking here, he's going to say, okay, the eyes are not the result of natural selection, the disappearance of the cave fish eyes, okay? But here he's going to make his strong case, not on the neck, right, but on the tail. Yeah, he says, could such a trifling object, something that just switches flies away, could that really matter so much that natural selection, that animals would live or die on this trait, on how well tufted their tail was, and whether it was 8 feet long or not? He says, yet we should pause before being too positive, even in this case, for we know that the distribution and existence of cattle and other animals in South America absolutely depends on their power of resisting the attacks of flies, right? Of insects. So that individuals which could by any means defend themselves from these small enemies would be able to range into new pastures and thus gain a great advantage. Right? And this brings up another role in Darwin's thought that I didn't mention in the other slide, migration. Migration was extremely important to Darwin. We think of migration and biogeography as becoming important in like the 1960s and 70s, 80s, right? In fact, it was extremely important to Darwin. It was how you explained the origin of species and their spread into other areas, right? Crucial. So anyway, he spent quite a lot of time on this. And you can see that the tail is not just the shape. It can really maneuver this thing, right? It can get flies from all over the rear end of its body, right? What's this little guy? Do you see the little guy there? This is an oxpecker bird. And the giraffe has opened his mouth so that the oxpecker can get at the teeth. Now, this is a behavioral adaptation that natural selection has fine-tuned, and the oxpecker can manage to get enough food between the teeth of these giant mammals and bugs on their back and dust and things like that, dust mites and small animals. It manages to eke out an existence. And so you see here what Darwin called the economy of nature, and others. It was a term that originated with Linnaeus, right? The economy of nature, everything working together, and for Darwin, natural selection acting as an important force within that framework, but not the only driver of the show. So, and if you look at the giraffe's mouth, there are other interesting things about the giraffe. Their tongues are astonishing. They really are. Yeah, the tongues, the tails, the neck, that sort of thing. You think, okay, well, what a weird creature, right? We've got one giraffe. I mean, there's 4 different kinds, perhaps, but there's basically one giraffe, right? Well, the giraffids are a family of creatures, and the okapi is the other living member of the giraffid family, and it's pretty weird too. I think they're wonderful. You can see it when you look at the head. It has the 2 horns. So you can see how it's like a giraffe. It's a giraffid, right? And it also has some of these amazing characteristics. If you can see, that's its tongue. And it's licking the opposite side of its shoulder, of its neck. You see? And this one is reached over the fence and is getting foliage, right? It's taking leaves, right? So this issue of being a sort of lineage of organisms that can reach for things, that can, in some ways this goes together. The sorts of genetics that, these critters have allow them to do things like this, where the genetics in other ones don't go that direction. There aren't a lot of giraffids in evolutionary history, but there's a good smattering of them. Most of them are deer-like. At the bottom here, you can see these older ones are kind of deer-like. But the okapi, the giraffe, and then there's this big thing called Shivatherium, which is bizarre. And in a way, if you look at the outline of it, even though that's a big horn, it still has almost that look as a giraffe. It's that kind of a thing somehow. And there may be an element of sexual selection as well, of individuals, females in particular, favoring males that have these more extreme traits. Darwin invented the idea of sexual selection to account for things that he felt that natural selection just in a sort of environment couldn't account for. But that females that genetically were attracted to a particular trait, if it was what's often called an honest criterion, an honest challenge, like famously the peacock's tail, right? That a peacock who builds a good tail really does have a good immune system and a better metabolism. So if that's an honest character and the female is attracted to that, then her offspring are going to benefit from that. If she's attracted to things that are not honest characters, honest indicators of quality as they're called, then her offspring are not going to survive, and the attraction for that thing will disappear from the population. So it's good natural selection stuff. But when you look at the evolutionary history of giraffids, it's just amazing. These Shivatherium, all these different configurations that they had. Here's one that has 6 of the head knobs, right? And there's one where they've grown together sort of like a moose. There's one over here where the middle 2, it has 6 as well, I think, and then they have become this sort of tiara on the front. Why do you get this showing up? Why would you get this trajectory almost of evolution in this particular lineage, right? Why can't natural selection, why didn't it produce something horse-like, right? It seems like it might have had enough scope. Similarly, here are elephants, elephantids, right, through history. And you can see as time goes on, you start with something small with a little bit of tooth development, right? You go to something that's got a bit of a trunk and it's got the small tusks. Then you go to things actually, some of which have the tusks on the bottom instead of coming out of the top. And you start to think there's something more than just natural selection going on here, right? Why do you get this tooth elaboration in one lineage and the head prong elaboration in another, right? Is there more than just natural selection or just Darwin's ideas of correlations of growth at work here? What do these trends mean? And you can look at dinosaurs in the fossil record. I mean, this is amazing, these ceratopsian dinosaurs. So I'm going to leave that picture up there as we go to questions.
Is there any such thing as a normal animal? I would think that to a giraffe, we would be extreme.
Well, I did have some urging to talk about humans in the talk, because what could be more extreme than someone that does, rollerblades and McDonald's, right? And I guess coming from anthropology, humans and primates seem like the normal ones, right? But I think the answer would be no, there are no normal animals, no normal, right? There's just this proliferation of amazing stuff, right? And just like the chemosynthetic bacteria, right? Nylon was invented in the 50s, right? By the 60s, there were bacteria who survived eating only nylon. It's astonishing what can happen.
Yeah, back to the ice fish. How long would it take for has anybody tried to put an ice fish in light and see how many generations it would take to get ice back?
So that's the sort of experiment that doesn't get funding from the National Science Foundation. It's an interesting thing about whether evolution will reverse itself, right? It depends on whether the genetic variation that would have allowed it to develop in the first place is still around. And of course, if you're selecting for one thing, often you're losing genetic variation on another side. And so there's no particular reason to think that they would be able to do that, but it wouldn't be impossible.
But don't genes turn on and off?
They do, and like I say, you can find things that will reverse. To give a familiar example, the peppered moth, everybody knows the peppered moth story, that in England there were these peppered moths that were light-colored, brown and black mottled, but mainly light-colored. And as the Industrial Revolution went on and the soot blackened the trees, then the darker varieties were favored. And then after the pollution started to get cleaned up in the 70s, it went back. And in most places, the lighter varieties then started to take over again. But there were a few places where the dark ones stayed. And they ended up disappearing from those places, basically because it changed, because they had lost that variation in order to go back. So it's complex. It's complex, yeah. Peter had a...
So, Patricia, thank you. Like others, I was wondering what extreme evolution was, so I Googled it and came across an interesting... Well, I came across an interesting article about cichlids, fish in Lake Victoria, that have enormous variation. And the point of the article was that they have a different set of genetic mechanisms, jumping genes, repetitive genes, that seem to make their genome more, if I understood correctly, more ready to respond to the changes in the environment. So for that, it was like extremely rapid evolution. Is that an illustration of extreme evolution in the way you're using it?
It is similar to the way we're about to talk about it, actually. Because I think the question, as you say, are there other mechanisms? Are there things that cause evolution to work differently at different times? Right? I also had my question slide there, which is also cute. Yeah, so one of the things about those fish is that they will speciate via, hard reproductive isolation by doubling their chromosome number, like a plant would do. There are very few. There's some of those, there's some frogs, but for the most part, animals don't do that, but these fish do. And so as soon as they get some of that variation, if they double their ploid, right, their number of chromosomes, that locks it in. And so that's how you get this continuous ability to change. Yeah. And the question is, why would that level of flexibility exist? Why aren't there other organisms that do that? What's special about them?
We hope you've been enjoying the Origin Science Scholars Program with Dr. Patricia Princehouse. Dr. Princehouse is the director of the Institute for the Science of Origins Origins Major, the first in the country. In the second part of our talk, we learned about the evolution of extreme traits, like the giraffe's long neck. In our final segment, Dr. Princehouse will talk about how simple genetics can generate so much diversity. Now, back to our talk.
On this question about mechanisms, right, I want to introduce a concept that is not that familiar to my American colleagues, but which I call the German synthesis. We've heard of the Anglo-American modern synthesis, which is popular. But the Germans also had a synthesis in which they addressed a lot of these questions that we're only just now coming to. And so Rudolf Wedekind in the 20s said, synthesis doesn't mean a conclusion. It doesn't mean you have a synthesis and then you're done. Right? He says it's an intellectual orientation and points out ways that research can progress further. His student, Otto Schindewolf, wrote a book called Evolution, Critique, and Synthesis in the 30s, just before World War II. And he says that on the basis of this that he's putting forth, we'll be given a robust synthesis and a mutual completion of the discoveries from the experimental, exact inductive methods of research on heredity and from the historico-deductive character of paleontological research. And so unlike the Anglo-American modern synthesis, which kind of left paleontology to the side in many respects, paleontology was central to the German synthesis. Schindewolf studied ammonoids, and it's an interesting thing about ammonoids and nautilus, things like that, because as they grow, they keep a record of their development, right? Because they just add on chambers, and so you can look back and see all of their development, all of that embryology that's gone on in a way you can't when you're just looking at even an insect, right? Because that's all gone since they transform their body, right? And so he felt that basically paleontology as a science could only be done on invertebrates because vertebrates they're not numerous enough and you can't tell the embryology very well of the fossil ones, and so he only sort of humored his colleagues in vertebrate paleontology that they were at all scientists. But anyway, so here's the ammonoid. They're related to modern nautiloids, but they went extinct in the Cambrian or the Cretaceous extinction, the KT extinction. It's interesting. Schindelwolf was an anti-Nazi in Germany at the time of the Second World War, and a lot of his colleagues didn't really survive. They were put in prison, or a friend of his hired him as a zookeeper at the zoo, the Berlin Zoo, and he spent most of the time sort of riding out in bunkers underneath, waiting for the Nazis to come and get him. And they never did. I guess paleontology was beneath their notice as well. But anyway, he got a lot of writing done, and in 1950 he put out a huge book giving his full views. And to sort of give a gloss to those, the German synthesis involves a hierarchy of levels of agency, right? So you don't just have selection acting just on genes or just on individual bodies or just on groups or species or higher level. You have it acting on all of those, right? And those levels can interfere with each other, right? So there's a lot going on in the German synthesis. He felt that the formation of new taxa involved various kinds of mutations. Now, this was in the days before DNA was known to be the hereditary material, before the structure was known, right? And there were, again, he was living in Nazi Germany, there were all kinds of wild claims being made about mystical influences and occult forces and things like that in evolution. He says, no, the material substance of genetics, whatever it is, right, of the genes, that's the only thing that you can talk about in science. He did feel that micromutations would give rise to local subspecies, so he had a role for variation in a very sort of normal Darwinian manner to what we would think today. But he also saw that there were increasing degrees of macromutation and systemic mutations involving major genomic rearrangements that would give rise to the higher levels, the higher taxa, families, classes, orders, things like that, right? He had a colleague, Richard Goldschmidt, that was a geneticist and is famous in a number of other contexts. But he got some of his genetics from Goldschmidt, who had a very different view of genetics than most of the Anglo-Americans at the time. So his concerns were some of the same ones as in Darwin's day, right? How do you get these developmental trajectories going on, both as individuals and when you're looking at a lineage in the fossil record and things like that. But Goldschmidt said, natural selection, it can weed out the unfit, but it doesn't create the fit. So there's no creative role for natural selection in Goldschmidt's model, right? Something else, basically these systemic mutations to the genome would produce the creative force, the variation, and that then natural selection had a role in weeding out the ones that didn't work. And that's a very different view from what we have, what we're used to. But he was, again, one of the very few workers looking for a physical chemical basis for speciation, right, in the days before DNA was known to be the hereditary material or the structure was known. And so what Schindelwolf put together between Goldschmidt and some of the others are what he called a typostrophe. And he says you can explain things like those giraffids, right, by understanding that a restructuring, a systemic mutation event would happen in a lineage, right? It would set up the possibility of all kinds of downstream weird morphologies developing. And that's what's shown in this picture here. All right, so this typogenesis phase, you have this sudden branching out. The variation would appear. And then it would slow down into these trajectories. And it would play out over time, just as we saw the Shivatherium and the giraffids sort of playing out over time with different manifestations, the different nose bumps of titanotheres or frills of the ceratopsian dinosaurs, things like that, in the typostasis phase. Right? And then at the end, you would run out of creativity in the genome. That amount of stuff would run out. There would be a phase of senescence that he called typolysis. And you would get really weird stuff showing up. And then you would get a mass extinction, and it would start all over again, right? He did have some ideas about where these genomic rearrangements came from, right? He thought that supernovas exploding would send cosmic rays, and it would cause a lot of extinctions, but it would also, some of these rearrangements would be useful, a little like the cichlid fish, and would set these things up. And Goldschmidt called these hopeful monsters, right? They would be monsters, but it might be a giraffe, it might be your hopeful monster, and it ends up having this lineage like that. We don't think that that's how it works, but we have other lower level explanations now because we do know the structure of DNA, and we do know a lot about how it works and this sort of thing. But the question remains, how can simple genetic systems, right? I mean, we've gone back, we've walked back the number of genes that there are in humans, right? There's 3 billion DNA nucleotide pairs, right? And we used to think, okay, when we sequence the genome, it's going to be about 100 million genes, right? Now we're down to there's probably 30 million. That's not a lot when you think about all of the stuff that we develop, right? So how can these increasingly, evidently simple genetic systems, and this is sometimes called macroevolution. All the questions I've been talking about here are macroevolution. We have our little toad or frog here that, you know, maybe in a population that's newly speciated, right? We look at variation in nature and we see a particular kind of variation, right? You see these salamanders that are going along these trajectories that mimic tadpole stages, right? What you don't see in either the fossil record or around today is something like this goat boy, right? When you see variation in hominids and hominoids and primates, right, you don't see things that mix in like, you know, aspects of goats or lions or things like that, right? It also happens along a trajectory. The Miocene apes that I look at, you know, they look a lot like other primates. They don't look, you don't get things like this. So there are constraints. And so what can these constraints be? Well, you know, I would call them creative, you know, constraints on the creative power of natural selection. Or why is morphospace all of the possibilities of what morphology or, you know, evolution could produce? Only partially occupied, right? There's lots of stuff that's not out there. And when it is occupied, it's occupied in clumps, ancestor-descendant clumps, right? So why don't we see any fish with wheels? Or birds with radar, or three-shelled clams that could do one thing on one side and the other? There's no reason these things couldn't exist, right? They don't appear. And one explanation that was used in Darwin's day by his cousin, Francis Galton, he said, if you think of what I'm calling morphospace solution, potential morphospace solutions, as billiard balls on a surface, well, if that surface is slanted, your billiard ball, you set it on there, and it just rolls downhill. So if you have an environment and you have an organism, species in it, natural selection can adapt that organism very finely, you know, tuning it to that environment if you have the right amount of variation for that, right? But what if, you know, and in order to have that variation, it must be small scale, a lot of it, and undirected with respect to the needs of the organism. Right? But what if these potential morphospace solutions are not sort of infinitely nudgeable by natural selection? What if it's polyhedra, right? Then, you know, your environment changes, the billiard ball level, billiard table tips, and you know, it rolls a little bit, but then it stops, right? Because there are constraints on how much that the adaptations of the species can fit the environment. Not to mention that the environment's always changing. Right? And so, you know, how do you bring these things into balance? Adolf Zeilacher was a student of Schindewolf who spent a lot of time here in the States and ultimately ended up spending half the year at Yale and half the year in Germany. And he has sort of synthesized, done a further synthesis of the Anglo-American modern synthesis and the German synthesis. And he says, you can think of it as a triangle. You've got functional constraints, right? There's stuff that works and doesn't work, right? The kind of adaptation that natural selection builds. you've got fabricational constraints. You can build certain things out of certain stuff, but you're not going to build a whole skeleton, to support a giant creature out of the kind of chitin that you have on an ant. You can't just make the ant bigger. The material stuff has to change. And then there's phylogenetic constraint. Phylogenetic constraint has to do with the entire history of the organisms that have gone before it, of the ancestors, right? And so you have the embryological constraints within that, and just the issues of how much variation do you have and what's the nature of it. And so another paleontologist that some of you know, Bob Bacher, he says, well, this is easy. The solution is that evolution is not just changes in gene frequencies, as we hear. He says that's a really stupid definition.
I know you haven't talked much about humans, but I was very interested, and I would like to know your opinion. Humans are one of the species, the only one I can think of, that can intentionally manipulate our genes, our genetic makeup, and tailor it as we believe we see fit for evolution. How do you view our ability to actively manipulate genes, its role in our future as humans, and what you might see along the spectrum of variability within us as we move forward?
I see two questions in there. One is, how do we manipulate our own DNA, and how do we manipulate other species? Right? And we had a series of talks in this forum about genetically modified organisms last fall. And I think that from that aspect, and especially if you think of genetically modified organisms as most commonly being taking a gene from one variety of wheat and splicing it into another variety of wheat, rather than taking 100 years to cross them back and forth until you get the one that you want, right? I think there really should not be any problem whatsoever with that, and I think that sort of thing is going to be crucial to our future as a species, to feeding ourselves, particularly as the environment is changing and we have a lot of species going extinct. I think that's a necessary element. As far as changing ourselves, we think we can do stuff, but we're not always, right about that, right? And so I think that the research into genetically modifying organisms would need to go very far down the road before we should start doing it to ourselves, except in very specific instances, like for curing diseases where you can have like something injected into the bone marrow, things like that. But as far as actually modifying our own germline, this is really dicey and very expensive. So I think that it may never play a big role going forward. It might, but I think that when the utility is obvious, like the different strains of wheat, things like that, then there's going to be a lot of research on it and emphasis on it, and I think that's correct. As far as we know, who's to say, when you're breeding cattle, right, dairy cattle, you breed for udder size. And you breed the ones who consistently produce larger udder size. But we don't have one criterion for what makes a proper human being. Right? People have had all kinds of ideas on that throughout history that they've fought over very bitterly. But even in one family, you can't decide, oh, well, what's the best thing about our family, right? So I think there's necessarily a subjective element when it comes to us, and that kind of question doesn't have a scientific answer.
The New York Times in the Sunday Review had an article, "Are These Birds Too Sexy to Survive?" On sexual selection and very...
oh, looky there. Here's the article. A volunteer from the audience.
Yes.
Ooh, pretty. All right, but I haven't read it yet, so tell me what it says.
Well, it essentially says that these particular birds have a song that's actually not a song. They clap their wings together in the manner of crickets. And the wing bones are have been modified in a manner that impedes their flying ability. And the suggestion is, or this particular researcher seems to believe that, well, the reason I asked the question, you use the phrase honest indicator. Thank you. And I suspect that this would be a counter example or an unhonest indicator in that should the little niche these birds live in no longer be appropriate habitat for their progeny, that they'll die out. So, kind of an interesting, and the implication is that the peacock's tail perhaps isn't as much of an indicator of its fitness as simply, I think the article uses the term decadence, decadent evolution.
Yeah, I don't know what they could mean by that.
I think what they mean by that is that
the females
sexual,
are,
the feature that appeals to the females.
But I mean, they've done, the peacocks you have done significant experiments on, where they'll cut off, you know, you'll have this male that grows this wonderful tail with all these eye spots, right? They'll cut off some of them, right? And that male then becomes less attractive to the female. So they definitely are fixating on the eye spots. And males that are more resistant to parasites make more eye spots, and males that have better metabolism, more efficient metabolisms, make more eye spots. So it really does seem to be a good, honest indicator. Now, in an environment that suddenly changed and they didn't have the food source, that may or may not be useful. And of course, what often happens if you have sudden environmental change is that species go extinct. They don't sort of have time to evolve, to adapt. But it's also possible that some of these things that, you know, are causing them to be you know, selected for this interesting dimorphism, right, might actually be useful in the next environment. You can't predict it, right? It might be. With the extinction of the dinosaurs, the end of Cretaceous extinction, some of these little single-celled organisms that have little shells, right? A lot of them went extinct in the tropical areas, but ones that had a sort of hibernation phase in the polar areas, after the you know, sun came back, right? Those then repopulated the entire population, right? Diatoms, right?
I mean, if you have the term honest indicator, do you have
I don't like this honest indicator of quality, right? That's what they call it, but it's, and then they'll talk about quality males, right? This sort of thing. Well, they'll talk about quality males. The female is able to recognize a quality male, and that is a special quality that she has, right? That will enable her to do that, and then she, because of this ability, leaves more offspring, right? I think that you run into all kinds of anthropomorphism in using these terms. I think we could find better terms, right? So.
Well, I just wondered if you had an example of unhonest indicators for sexual selection.
Not offhand. Bodybuilders. That's the thing, and is the ability to use artificial resources advantageous or not? Yeah.
The Origin Science Scholars Lectures are presented by Case Western Reserve University's Institute for the Science of Origins, with the assistance of the Siegel Lifelong Learning Program, the College of Arts and Sciences, and MediaVision. For more information on the Origin Science Scholars Program, including a full video archive, please visit the Institute's website at origins.case.edu.